Hi everyone, this is chapter 16 Qualitative Methods of Data Collection. In this chapter, we'll cover the four major or most common types of qualitative methods, namely interviews, focus groups, narratives, and ethnography. We'll probably only cover half of this chapter in this lecture, and then we'll continue with the rest of it in another lecture. So we'll cover some of the basics of collecting qualitative data in this lecture, and we'll see how far we'll go in terms of the first qualitative method, which is interviews. But before then, we will first look at this first slide right here on observation strategies. So the textbook author gives us a method for the seamless container. So the seamless container is just an idea, so you don't have to follow it exactly as it is, but it gives us a structure, an idea on how do we collect participant observation data if we are studying anew, like most of us. So one way we could do is, for example, say you're observing people at a cafeteria. So I've been using this example for a number of lectures. Say you're observing people in a cafeteria, so you find yourself situated somewhere comfortable. Maybe you're sitting behind a table, you have your lunch or have your laptop or your textbook or whatever, and you're scanning the room. So the seamless container is a way to scan the room, a systematic approach. The textbook tells us you can start from the left of the room. So imagine the whole room as if it is a circle or an oval. So pretend it's a circle or an oval. You want to work around the perimeter of this circle and oval. So starting from the left, you'll see what do you observe? Maybe it's the entrance. You see people coming in. You see people coming in with backpacks, and then they might be coming individually or with some friends. They might be looking like they are hurrying, trying to come in really quickly, maybe because they are late for class, they just want to grab a quick bite. Maybe they're meeting a friend, so they're walking in really quickly, looking around. And then after you have finished describing what you see in that part of the room or that part of the environment, you then move towards another section of this oval. So maybe at the top of this oval, well, what do you see? Maybe there's where the food is lined on the shelves. What do you see there? Maybe there are different kinds of snacks, maybe packets of different mixed nuts, for example, or maybe candy bars or chocolate bars or whatever you see. How many shelves are there? Are they well stocked? What kind of cookies or what kind of chocolates do you see? Do people just hang around those shelves, making their choices, or they probably already know what they're looking for? Maybe they just go right directly to that shelf that they want. They know where to get the food that they want. They grab and they go, or do they stand around the shelves, comparing maybe say different types of snacks, or maybe the prices or quantity or whatever it is? So you describe that part of that oval and you slowly move to the right side and then eventually back down to you from where you observe this environment, the circle or the oval. Now it's very important that the qualitative researcher also takes note of him or herself's point of view. Why do we make this observation? How do we see things? It's from where we stand. Why do we give certain observations or things that we observe? Why do we highlight those? Why do we give them so much detail? Why do we focus on what we are seeing? How do we analyze it? So these are all important details that we will like to take note and write down, because it gives us, when we review our notes, gives us a way to remember what we observe. So it could be notes that you've written from a few months, a few years ago, and then when you take it out and take a look again, it helps to refresh your memory. It brings you back to that instance, that time where you were sitting behind that table looking around that room using the seamless container approach. So here on this slide, you see there are several questions that you can ask the people, the setting, the context, but I have give us a way to remember them using the explanation that I gave us earlier. All right, so let's look. What do we do then as we make those observations, meaning the things that we see, what we register while we are using the seamless container metaphor, while we take notes. So you can have a notebook, or maybe if a laptop, if that's what you prefer, we can have it open and get type notes as we see. Maybe you see someone coming in, you see a few people coming in, maybe a group of guys coming in together. You can take note of those. What are they wearing? Maybe they are all wearing the same jersey or the same shirt that has the same print on the front of their shirts. Maybe they belong to a certain club, or maybe some football team, or whatever it is. So those kinds of observations that you make, take them down. Now, take them down, write them down. Sometimes in some situations it's okay to be taking notes. For example, in a cafeteria, no, you don't seem strange or unusual having people writing things or typing things in that environment. Now, there might be places where taking notes will not be allowed. So, for example, say you gain access to watch a company's board of directors. They are having their annual or their monthly meetings, and you gain access to that private environment. You go in there, but maybe the sponsor said, I'm gonna let you come in and observe what we do at our annual meeting, but you cannot take notes. You cannot have your laptop out typing things or writing something on your notepad. So if that's the condition, in order for you to gain access to observe, then you have to honor that condition. You cannot take notes. But if you are allowed to in a place like a public setting, then then you should definitely take notes, because it helps you to remember what you see. Now, in the example that I gave you earlier, if you cannot take notes, then what should you do? Well, then take notes right after, immediately, as soon as you can, after what you have observed. So back to the example about the board of directors who are having the annual meeting. Maybe they said, you are not allowed to take notes, whether digitally or on a piece of paper. So what you got to do is you're going to be paying lots of attention while the meeting is ongoing. You got to pay a lot of attention, recall, remember the things that you see, encode those details in your memory, try to capture as much as you can, and after the meeting, immediately jot down notes and put down details on either on your laptop or your notepads. So by doing that, you transfer what you have remembered seeing immediately, as soon as you can, the instance that you're allowed to, so that as much as what you remember is translated on your notes, your few notes. One point right here that's really important is that you should take more notes than you believe is necessary. Why is that so? Because at that point when you're observing, you might think, nah, that's not really a big detail. Maybe I don't really think it makes sense, or it doesn't connect with the other things I see. But if you observe it, if you notice it, you see it, write it down. Reason because when you go back to your notes weeks or years after, you may then be able to make those connections that you did not or were not able to make when you were at that place observing. So always take more notes than you think is necessary. Always helpful, doesn't hurt. Well, maybe you have to write a lot more pages, or maybe there's a lot more things you type up in your electronic file, but data is good. Always remember, collect them, keep them, and then look at them after the observation. So taking more notes than you think is necessary, capture what participants say. I think that's really gold and important. If you're able to verbatim remember or take or write down what people say, the exact words or the expressions, comments, phrases or the words that they use, that's really good, because when you have those exact words or phrases or comments that they make, it becomes so much stronger because it's in the participant's voice. It is exactly what they think, it's exactly what they said. So that's much more powerful than you paraphrasing what they say. Okay, so your notes should include some of these things, such as who are these people, meaning to say the participants, the people that you observe, the people that you see. Who are they? Okay, what are their roles and relationship with each other? Do they look like they're friends? Do they look like they know each other? Are they enemies? Are they fighting? What kind of distance are they keeping from one another? Are they? Do they look like they're chatting? Do they look like they're not talking? Okay, so things like that you can infer from based on your observation, looking from a distance. But those things are also important that you write down on your notes. Thirdly, what kind of activity are they performing? So essentially, what are they doing? What do you see them doing? So those are some questions to start you thinking if you're doing participant observation. What are the things to look out for and the details to put on your few notes? What kind of artifacts are involved? Meaning to say, what kind of things are those people who are in the cafeteria, for example? What are they holding? Are they holding on to bags of chocolate chips, maybe some kind of candy, or maybe they have some kind of sandwich or something tasty or delicious, like say I don't know, like fried chicken or whatever it is. What kind of artifacts? What are the things that are involved that they're holding on to, that they touched, that they look at, and who uses these artifacts, and how is it used? How do we determine the use? So writing it down, remembering, recalling how those artifacts are in the process of the participants' interactions or behaviors in that context. More detail is better. More is best. So if you can paint it in as much detail as you can, for example, I can see that person holding a bag of chips, and I can see the chips is whatever the brand is. Maybe you can even tell the flavor, and then maybe you say you are at a cafeteria and you're observing people buying chips, okay, potato chips. Maybe by the number of people who are near the shelves that sells the chips and the number of times people grab a certain brand or certain flavor, you can then conclude that a certain brand or a certain flavor is the most popular during that time that you're observing. So the more details that you have, the better it is. Remember, it doesn't hurt to have those extra details. Always good to have more, because you will probably find them useful when you analyze them weeks or months down the road. So two types of things to take note. Author gives us this example where you on a sheet of paper you can have a left side and a right side writing different things. You can use this system. I think it's a useful system, but if you have a different system that you prefer over the years as you become more experienced in doing participant observation, you can definitely use other kinds of systems. But a system that we have here is on the left side, we describe what we observe. So what do we see? Who are involved? Who are the people there? You know, when did it happen? What time is it? And where? What's the location? What's the setting? And then on the opposite side of that piece of paper, on the right side, you can do some analysis. So why do these people come in at this time? You know, is there a specific reason why you see a high number of people at the cafeteria between a certain number of between say 12 and 1:30 as compared to say 1:30 to 3, or what are the reasons? Why do you observe certain things that you see? And how is that so? What are the reasons, or what might suggest that this were to happen? This happens at this time. So on the right side is your analysis. They may or may not be exactly what you see, but you're inferring. You're inferring what you have observed on the left hand column, what you have observed, what you described, and then you're inferring some kind of meaning or what you think might have happened. Okay, explaining what you saw in terms of the people and the things, the artifacts that you see. So those are the two types of notes that you can take. The one that is more factual, the more descriptive, and then on the right hand side, the more analysis, the more inferential kind of data. All right, so you can also do digital note taking, and this is something that is on the uprise as we become more, as technology becomes more accessible. We have digital audio recorders, and sometimes, or actually, I think most of our phones can do audio recording. So if you don't like to type on your laptop, or if you don't want to write in your notepad, digital note taking can be also be a pretty good alternative to this to choose. One thing to note about audio recording or video recording, um, some people are uncomfortable recording as we see on this slide, but I think actually a lot of people are uncomfortable when you say I'm going to record either audio in just audio or just audio, not even video. A lot of people feel uncomfortable. They might not act naturally or behave naturally as they usually do. So if you are using some kind of digital note taking involving a participant or participants, always tell them up front that, hey, I'm going to do some audio or video recording. Is that okay? It's always important that we get the consent, that they know what we are doing and how we're going to collect the data, and they have to know that we're using it for that kind of purpose, and if they consent to saying yes, is informed consent, then we proceed. If we don't have their consent and we audio or video record them, that will be unethical behavior, and that is something that no researcher should do. It's unethical, it's not good, period. All right. Now, if suppose a participant says, okay, you can audio record this conversation, then always tell your participant that I know you say that audio recording is fine, but I also want to let you know that at any point during this conversation or interview, if you say you want to turn off the recording, I'm perfectly okay with that as well. So you want to let your participant feel comfortable in sharing their views and thoughts, but at the same time, you want to let them also be comfortable that when they feel like they have to stop the recording for any reason, they can ask you to do so. And you should, if a participant says so, you should definitely honor that request. All right. So that's about using digital note taking or digital recording in terms of collecting data, either taking notes or interviews, which will spend a bit more time at the end of this segment, this part of the lecture, and probably a little bit the beginning of the next part, starting from chapter second half of chapter 16. All right. So we transcribe few notes in this segment. We transcribe few notes. So what do we mean by that? When we transcribe few notes, what we're saying is that from the recording, the audio recording from the previous slide, we record those details on transcript, so a written form. Okay, in written form. So there are two ways that we do transcription. The first method, as you see on this slide, word for word transcription. What that means is that during the audio recording of an interview, you finish a recording, now you have the audio filed, you transcribe it word for word. So we are faithful to what the words was said during interview. Both you and the participant will type it out as exactly as what you and your participant said. So it's word for word, it's exactly as it is, it's verbatim. So what was on the audio recording is what you will see on that written file. Another method that researchers typically use or may use is that we might add additional reflection and questions as the researcher transcribes the audio file. So what that means is, as the researcher is transcribing that audio file into a written document, they also add additional information as they remember what happened during that time, what were the thoughts or reflections or analysis or takeaways that they had when they were while they were conducting the interview. So it's a bit more in-depth, it adds more nuance to the transcript that they would produce from the audio recording, but it's also very useful because, as we remember, more information, more details will always be good. All right, so there are two different methods that we might use. In transcribing audio recordings, either verbatim word for word or the same thing, but adding additional reflection, thoughts, and details that we can recall. One important thing for researchers as we transcribe our interviews is that we should not tidy up what people say. So what that means is that, for example, if a participant took a long pause, for example, took a long pause before speaking, and then once he or she starts talking, there's a lot of verbal fillers like ums and ahs, and maybe a lot of repetition of certain words. You don't want to clean that up. You don't want to take them out of your transcript. Reason because you want to keep them there so that when you read the full transcript, you have a fuller sense of how the interview went. So were there certain words that the participant kept saying, that they keep emphasizing, that they keep coming back to, they keep repeating? Maybe those words or ideas are very essential to the question that you ask. Maybe they're very key to answering or understanding the phenomenon that you want to study. So those extra repeated words, those verbal fillers, keep them in there. Keep them in the transcript so that when you see them, when you read the full transcript and you compare the full transcript with the other interviews, you can hopefully pick up some themes or some recurring patterns. Okay. Another important note is that if the interview was conducted face to face or in the same setting, or perhaps online or online where you can see each other in the video, it's also useful to take notes of those non-verbal behaviors. So meaning to say, how did the participant behave, or sorry, how did they act during the interview? Were they shifty? Were they looking uncomfortable? Were they scratching? Were they moving in a certain way? Were they very conscious of their environment? So their body language, the non-verbal actions that they present during the interviews, those are very useful and important details to take note if you notice those. Now, so as we were saying earlier, what if you cannot take notes during the interview or during the observation? Then you will have to transfer things that you can remember, as much of the details as you can, immediately as soon as you can when the opportunity arises. So maybe you may be able to retreat from that setting, and then you can excuse yourself and then write notes and then come back in. Or perhaps there are scheduled frequent breaks that you can take so that during those breaks you transfer things that you observe, that you see, onto something like, say, a notepad or a piece of paper. Okay. Always remember that recording things that you see as you see them, describe them as you see them, is key, because it helps you to come back to that setting when you go back and reread your notes. All right, interviews. So now we come to the first of the four major types, or the most popular types of qualitative data collection method. So the first one is interviews, and interviews are a practical approach because it gives us a way to connect to people in a one-on-one, usually a one-on-one or two-on-one dialogue and exchange, a way to ask questions and to hear people's responses or thoughts. So interviews are very useful. There are a few different kinds of interviews, so let's take a look at them. Firstly, there is the field interviewing or field interviews. So these are kinds of interviews that happen in the field. Now, as qualitative researchers, what do we mean by the field? Well, the field means that the environment that we bring ourselves into. So the cafeteria. Cafeteria is the field. It is the environment where I find my participants in. So I'm going into that environment that I find them in. That is the field. I might be able to talk to people in the cafeteria, maybe someone who is sitting on the next table. I can ask him or her what he or she is thinking, or the thoughts, or the any types of question, the informal, in an informal way, informal interview. about anything that relates to my research question. Now, of course, if you are doing that, make sure that you have some kind of institutional review approval so that you can legitimately ask those questions as part of your research and part of data collection. Okay. So few interviews happen in the field, can be formal, can be informal. We talked a little bit about informal earlier. Can be formal too. So formal interviews are ones that are scheduled, that we know is going to happen, but we're doing it in the field, in the environment that we find our participants in. So, what are some strengths and limitations of online interviewing? So, we do look at field interviews earlier, but these days there are also the prevalence of online interviews. Online interviews are also growing. Why? Because it gives us access to participants who may not be in the same geographical location as we are. So, for example, I've done research where I interview participants who are or who were in other states, who are not in Texas, who are not in Houston, but they are in other states. I have interviewed, I think, one or two participants who were in Alaska. So that's pretty cool because I've never been to there, but by using some kind of online media, I'm able to connect with the participant who is somewhere very far away. So we look at online interviews. What are the strengths? Low cost. So if I want to interview the participant in Alaska, I didn't have to fly with her or she didn't have to fly to me. It's low cost. Over the internet, it's really easy. Now, ways to collect data from people who are geographically distant is the example that I've given you, the participant who was in Alaska when we conducted the interview. For some kind of interviews, perhaps the participants' identities are more sensitive. We do not want to have their identities revealed, or maybe they have to mask their identities. So, conducting interviews online helps to conceal that aspect of our interviewees. So, there are some really good strengths when we look at online interviewing as compared to face to face or field interviews. On the flip side, online interviews also has its own limitations. So what are those? Find it difficult to build rapport with participants. Think about your own experiences when you're interacting with your family or your friends. If it's over, say, online, say Skype, it makes it much harder to make that kind of connection, to feel like we are connected. Whereas face to face, because of the close physical proximity, it feels much easier to talk to that person because we are closer. All right, so that's one limitation. A second limitation is that it can give the participant an opportunity to develop fictional social reality. So they might, because of the distance that we are in, say me here in Houston and someone else in somewhere another location. Because of that distance, because of that media while you're using online, it may give the participant a fair sense that they can be more creative in how they express what they're saying, so more fictional, less true. Okay, but nonetheless, even if they are a little bit more creative in how they express or what they think or what they say, it is still their construction reality. We will have to take note of those and record them as well. Another limitation of online interviews is that it changes the context of the interviewing. It is more artificial when we are interviewing in two different locations that are quite different. Imagine if you're interviewing someone and you are in an office, an office, four walls, but the person is, say, in a park. Okay, the noise at the park, the sound of the birds and people around, that can affect the interview. The ambience definitely will have some impact on the interview. So that kind of environment, when it's not controlled, not contained, can also be a form of limitation to online interviewing. So when we do interviews, one of the things that we think about. So here are 7 steps or 7 areas of interviewing process that we think about. First, we have to think about the research questions that we want to ask. So we have to be very thorough and thoughtful about the research questions that we want to ask. because if we are not creating an interview protocol or interview guide that helps us answer the research questions, as we said in chapter 15, it is a waste of our time as well as the participants' time, right? So step number 2, we design the interview. What kind of interview are we going to do? Is it going to be online? Is it in the field? Is it going to be face-to-face? And then we conduct the interview. Prior to conducting the interview, we have to schedule it if it's a formal interview. But if it's an informal interview, if we get an opportunity, we may conduct the interview. So that's the actual process of asking questions. After we are finished with the interviews, asking them the questions that we have prepared, then we transcribe them, and then that's step number 4. When we transcribe them, we talked about earlier, do we do verbatim or do we add additional notes? After we have done that, step number 5, we analyze the data that we have collected. So the transcript that we have transcribed, we analyze the data to see if there are recurring themes or similar ideas that they're consistent between the participants. We actually will want to do step number 6 as well. We will verify the data as we analyze it. Reason because we want to make sure that the data is accurate, is accurate as what the participants have told us during the interview. We did not interpret them wrongly or put their ideas in a different context. Finally, step number 7, we will develop our analysis as a written report. So the journal articles that we have been reading, that we have seen in our other courses, those are written reports of research that were done by researchers and their analysis and their discussion of what those research mean in relation to the research question. So that relates back to step number 1. So when we conduct the interview, what are the details that are important? So the selection of the location is important, and the times. Those should be at the usually should be at the convenience of the participants, because when they feel comfortable, when they are accessible during those times, that is the time where you are able to interview them. So in my research, when I conduct interviews, oftentimes it is at a time and location that is most suitable for the participants. Sometimes I interview them early in the morning or even late at night because that's the times that they are available. And so I have to avail myself during times when they are available and when they feel most comfortable and ready to help me. Right? Interviews can also be done in pairs where you have 2 interviewees interviewing 1 participant. So when we have 2 interviewers, 1 person asks the questions, so that person is the interviewer, and the other person takes notes. And then maybe at some point during the interview, we can switch roles. So by doing that, we have 2 people looking at that interviewer, two people conducting the interview. So one person is asking the question, paying attention to the non-verbal and paying attention to the responses from the participant, asking follow-up questions. On the other hand, the second interviewer is taking notes as well. And then you can switch roles so that we don't feel overly tired, because interviews, when done properly and done right, is actually very exhausting. It's much more than just simply asking questions. It's asking questions that are very directed questions that pertain to helping us address or understand or answer the research question that we have. All right, so we would ask questions during interviews, but as we said, it's not just asking questions. Those are very thoughtful, strategic questions that we ask. We have to think about how we construct those questions, how do we sequence them, and based on the sequence and based on the flow, we put it on our interview guide, and then we follow a certain sequence. Sometimes we may not follow the sequence as we have. So that is fine as well, as long as it allows a more natural flow during that interview, and that will be fine. Oftentimes in an interview, we might start off by asking some relevant biographical questions. to help us contextualize the data that we'll collect. So things like, could you tell me your age? Could you tell me about your sex? Now, of course, if you want to ask those biographical questions, they have to be relevant to the research questions. The questions that we have on our interview guide or interview protocol should allow our participants to tell our participants to tell their side of the story. What is important to them? What is the way they perceive things? It is really their view, their construction of reality, their observation of events. Those are the key things that we do interviews for because we want to know it from their point of view. So open-ended questions are always better than closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions typically will be questions like what or how or when, rather than questions that would only yield fixed number of responses such as yes or no. Okay. Interviewing techniques is important that we always ask questions. We ask those questions, but we also want to listen. Okay, we want to spend more time listening than talking. We want to ask questions, always follow up if you don't understand, or maybe even if you think you understand, it's always good that you ask a follow up just to clarify, just to be double sure that what you think you understand is actually what the participant meant. Don't interrupt, let them talk. People are spending time to give us an insight of their world. So don't interrupt, let them talk, let them express, share their worldview with you. Okay, be careful of sharing your own personal experiences or opinions. You don't want to bias your participants. You don't want to shape the way that they give you their answers in a certain fashion. So be mindful, don't share too much of what you want to what you think about the event, because ultimately is what's important is that you want to know how they think rather than you telling them what you think. Now, of course, at the end of the interview, you can then tell them what you think, or if they are interested, they ask, you can then share. But prior to that, it's a good idea that you want to capture what they think before they make any assumptions about what you want to hear or what you think. During the interview, it's important to monitor our nonverbal behaviors, so the expression that we give is very important. Now, do we smile when we are interviewing? Do we look like we are withdrawn during the process? Those can affect how your participants think about the interview process, how they will respond or react, and those will have implication to what they will share with us. Silence is okay. Sometimes silence is a way for people to think, to recall, to construct their answers. So it's okay to let your participant have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 seconds to think about the answer, and during those 4, 5, 6 seconds they might be silent or you might be silent, and that is okay. At the end of the interview, good practice is to debrief your participant. Tell your participants the main points and things that you found that were new in those interviews. Provide them information that you previously withheld from them, but now you can share with them. Ask your participants if they have any questions for you. Sometimes they might think about questions during the process, and they wonder why do you ask them a certain way, or why you're interested in certain questions, certain things or events. So let them have the opportunity to interview in some way as well. Thank your participants for their time and for their contribution to the research, and then we transcribe the interview at the end of the interview. So to wrap up this first method, what are the strengths of interviews? If you're doing face-to-face interviews, it allows us a more natural way to clarify, to verify things that you have heard. It's easier to collect data that way because you can actually observe their nonverbal, and your nonverbal can help with facilitating the interview process. Now, what's the limitation of interviews? On the other hand, you may produce or you might generate a lot more data than you need. So to pass through to analyze that data can take a lot of time, and we look at that in chapter 15, where if we don't have enough resources or time to work through those dense amount of data, then it will slow down the process, and that may not be a good thing. Okay, interviews. A limitation number two is that participants can stray off course because you're asking them a question, you want to see where they can take with that question. So they might take a long-winded way of answering a question, but sometimes we can't just cut them because we don't know how far they need to go before they come back to the central questions. So you might hear them talking about lots of things. They beat around the bush, talk about other things before they come back. So it takes a lot of experience for a good interviewer to guide the participants to answer the questions in a more concise fashion. And then thirdly, participants might feel hesitant to talk, maybe because they feel uncomfortable talking about the topic. Maybe they think that there might be repercussions if they say certain things. They might be withdrawn. So there are some of those considerations when we think about interviews. Do people feel forthcoming in sharing information? To what extent they are, or how much are they concerned or withdrawn? They are more reserved. So those are also limitations when we think about interviews. So this is the end of this first half of chapter 16, and we'll pick up the rest of the other three qualitative methods in the next lecture. Hi everyone, so this is a continuation of chapter 16. Last time we talked about interviews, and here we continue with focus groups. So focus groups are led by a facilitator, usually the researcher, him or herself, but it can be someone else as well. So the facilitator is someone who is experienced in leading group discussions, and facilitating, helping the participants in a group to talk freely, to share freely on the topic. So it's very similar like an interview, where oftentimes is the researcher or researchers talking with the participant, but in a focus group, we have more people or more participants. Now, see, the first bullet point talks about usually 5 to 10 participants. So that's a pretty good number. If you have something between 5 and 10 participants, and with the facilitator asking questions and letting the participants participate and talk, and then agree or disagree among themselves, that will give you a very robust discussion. The textbook tells us it's good to oversample maybe 20%. So if you are shooting for, say, 10 participants for every focus group session, maybe try to recruit 12 people. You probably can end up close to 10. But anything between 5 and 10, that would be a good number. Oftentimes, focus groups are about 60 to 90 minutes. I would say it's closer to 90 minutes, especially if you have a chatty group. And the thing about focus group is that it is very similar like interviews, where people might start off a little bit slower, a bit more hesitant, or more hesitant to share, but as they get into the groove of the conversation, as they think more about what you're asking, they start to become more chatty, they give you more information. So if the interview or the focus group starts off a bit slower, that's okay, because usually it picks up. Now, the respondents are encouraged to interact with one another. In focus group, the key conversation is the views that the participants, the 5 to 10 participants, are giving. So the facilitator's role really is to ask one or two questions to help the participants to start thinking about the topic that they are talking about, and then just stimulating that conversation and having the participants talk together. Okay, a focus group is not a decision making group, meaning to say we are not seeking for consensus. We're not looking for, at the end of 60 90 minutes, that everyone, all participants, agree on a certain point. That's not the idea. The idea is to have a group where everyone can feel comfortable talking and allowing all kinds of views, pros and cons, for and against, and different alternative views on that one topic to flourish, to be heard during that time. Focus groups are also not a marketing focus group, so there's a distinction between what is done in marketing, where there's a lot of work where the companies will bring in potential clients and then ask them questions to see how they think about a product before a launch. On the other hand, a research focus group, yes, the process is probably very similar, but the idea is not to try to sell something to the participants. The idea is to really want to hear what the participants have to say about a research phenomenon, a communication question, or issue that the researchers are interested in. So we're not wanting people to all end up having a consensus, agreeing on the same thing at the end of the session, and neither are we trying to sell something or to convince the participants about something. Okay, so when we conduct focus groups, we gotta be focused on asking our participants to share their views freely and to interact with one another. In a focus group, the facilitator also uses something like an interview guide or interview protocol that the interviews that we talked about in the previous lecture. So it's a series of questions. The facilitator goes through that series of questions. The facilitator may jump the sequence depending on the flow of the conversation as the focus group is transpiring. But the facilitator may also follow the exact sequence depending on the needs of the research. We will use a funnel example of funnel from general to more specific way of asking questions. So what that means is that we can open up more broadly, for example, at the start of the focus group, asking participants to say their names, to give us their names so that everyone knows everyone's names, and maybe say one or two things about their interest or maybe what brought them to that focus group. So to get the group start to talk and hear everyone talking. Okay, we open questions with a broad question so that is more inviting and more make things a little bit more accessible and make things more a little bit easier at the start. And it allows participants to respond, because if you have a broad question, it's not very specific, participants will not feel very narrowed, needing to answer the question in a very narrow way or give a very specific or a specific answer. So to start off more generally, more broadly, that's a good idea. So we talked about how do we conduct focus groups, but the first thing is, how do we get the participants there? Okay, how do we choose those participants? It's a good idea that our focus group participants belong to some heterogeneous kind of community, so they are kind of similar, they have some similar background but not entirely the same. It's a good idea if you have strangers, so meaning to say these 5 to 10 participants, they're all complete strangers, so that might allow them to feel more comfortable, less awkward. It seems counterintuitive, but sometimes when you have strangers coming together on the same topic, they somehow feel more comfortable talking. Imagine if there is something that, for example, we get people that you know very well, say your family members, and come together and do a focus group. That might serve some purposes depending on the research question, but we can also imagine it can get a little bit awkward to say certain things that you probably do not typically want to share with your siblings or your parents, for instance. Okay, so the screening of the participants is very important. Before we invite them and before they accept to be part of the focus group, we want to have groups that have more or less similar background so that everyone knows what this topic is about, or what this phenomenon or this communication is. But at the same time, we don't want them to be so similar that everyone is going to say the same thing. Okay, so that's a key idea of the focus group. You want to have the group sharing as diverse as many range of views as possible without artificially making it more narrow or too narrow or too broad. Okay, so over here we see the second dot point, over recruit by 20%. I've already talked about it in the previous slide. So if you over recruit by about 20%, you typically can hit the number that you are trying to get. Okay, All right, so conducting focus group typically it's about 90 minutes. On this slide, it says 2 slides ago we saw it was 60 to 90 minutes. That's typically the range, 90 minutes. But the book also tells us if you are arranging a focus group, shoot for say 120 minutes or 2 hours so that you have enough flexible time at the start just in case people are late or perhaps the conversation goes a little bit longer than anticipated. And here and there are some administrative issues that you might have to take care of and things like that, unanticipated issues. So if we are hosting a focus group, shoot for something like 2 hours so that if you end early, that's great. If you need a little bit more time to follow up, you have that flexibility. Okay. So as we said, open up a focus group, introduce ourselves, tell people our names, one or two things that brought us to this focus group. It's a good idea to serve some refreshment, always nice because people are going to be there for 1.5, 2 hours. So refreshments are always good. It gives them incentive to be there, to thank them for being part of this focus group, and to facilitate the conversation as we talk about the facilitator's role. At the end of that focus group, similar to the interviews that we will conduct, we'll summarize, provide feedback to our participants about what we have learned from that session, and then give them the opportunity to ask us questions as well. Okay. All right. First point may not be the researcher, so I already talked about that at the very beginning of the lecture. May or may not be the researcher, or maybe it can be another person who is not completely immersed or directly involved in the research, but is a trained facilitator who has the expertise, the knowledge to know how to facilitate a conversation well. Okay, so that person can be brought in and then to help host the focus group. Okay, so this person can also be someone with whom the participants can identify, maybe should. So if the facilitator is known among the participants, that also helps to lower anxiety, helps everyone feel a little bit more comfortable. And someone who is perceived as credible. Again, if you go back to the first lecture for this chapter, we talk about interviewers building trust and credibility. The same concepts apply even for focus groups. So if you think about interviews and focus groups, how are they different? Different in terms of the number of participants involved at every one time, but in terms of what the researchers wrote, in terms of how the researcher uses the interview guide to follow through a sequence of questions, to ask follow-up questions, clarifications. Those are very similar things that the facilitator in the focus group would do, as well as the interviewer would do in one-on-one or two-on-one interviews. And ultimately, it's very important that the focus group moderator or the facilitator has the communication skills to help people open up and to talk about the research interest of that focus group. We notice that this slide says a focus group moderator is the same idea as a focus group facilitator. It's just using two different terms. So one of the strengths of hosting a focus group, the strength is that first strength will be it provides opportunity for participants, 5 to 10 as we talked before, to be present and to share their views in their own words. Now it's very interesting when you have a group of people, even though they may observe or have the same experience, but when you ask them to explain it in their own words, in their own way, how they perceive it could be quite different. They might also use the same words quite differently or in different sense or meaning. So it's interesting when you have everyone together talking and listening in to each other, talk about a certain question or observation or event, and to see if there are any similarities or differences. Allows consensus or conflict to emerge among participants. So as one person says, this is what my experience is, someone else might jump in and say, hey, I also have a similar experience, or maybe a third person might say, that's quite different than my own experience. So remember that ultimately focus groups, our intention at the end of the focus group is to not have everyone agree on the same view or the same outcome, but really wanting to facilitate a process of talking about the event and see what kind of differences or similarities that people would have on that event. Okay. And because you have a few more participants than the interviews that you might conduct one-on-one or two-on-one, when you have 5 to 10 participants, you get to hear a much wider range of views, and it generates a little bit more information on that topic, much more quicker than would, say, interviews. What are the limitations of focus groups? One limitation is just like when you have a group of friends talking, people get chatty, people can talk over one another. So someone was starting on talking about something, and then before he has finished, someone interrupts, or maybe someone is saying something and then was thinking about it, might talk a little bit slower, but then someone else tries to finish her sentence, so when that happens, just like in a natural flow of conversations among friends and people, that can happen, and those interruptions can be a bit disruptive. Okay, people might be hesitant to express their opinions, especially if it's opposing or conflicting views. As we talked about earlier, interviews as well as focus groups. Sometimes people might start a bit slower. They might take a bit more time to think about things. They might be a little bit hesitant to offer details, but that's okay. That typically is the way it starts. But as we continue in the middle at the end of the interview or a focus group, people get to be a bit more chatty and start talking. Will be a little bit more concerning, especially if towards the end of the focus group, people are still relatively quiet. So there's quite a bit of concern. Another limitation of a focus group is that the researcher can exert too much of power over the participant. So maybe the participants feel afraid about something, or there might be some kind of influence that the researcher has over the participants, and so that would affect the quality of things that people might say, the extent or the detail that participants might share. Another limitation, and this is probably a bigger limitation towards the end of writing up the research, is that the researcher might overgeneralize the findings, especially if there's a lot of consensus happening within focus groups. The researchers might assume that that is the view that everyone, all participants, take. May or may not be accurate. It may be accurate because truly that's how everyone felt, but it can also be inaccurate and overgeneralization when perhaps some people are reluctant to talk, or maybe say they were still thinking about it, but they didn't have the opportunity to talk about it yet, but then we move on to the next question. So that is also a limitation of focus groups. Right, the third area of qualitative research methods that we opened when we started the first lecture for chapter 16, we also talked about narrative. So this is a third segment of these four parts of this lecture. Narratives are a little bit interesting because narratives are the stories that we hear from people that they tell us. It's not exactly a method in the sense that it's not the way that we collect information or data as as it will be the case for interviews as well as focus groups. Narratives, on the other hand, is the product or the outcome that we can gather through the interviews and focus groups that we've conducted. Narratives are very powerful because it stick to our minds. We remember them more clearly. It's from the participants' point of view. How do they view things? What makes sense to them? How do they see it? What they might see or what they might not see, and then we can compare it between different narratives across different participants. Narratives are usually told chronologically, so it's based on some historical timeline over a period of time from the past and then to more recent. So narratives are very useful, very powerful because they capture significant events over a period of time. It also reviews how the participants think about event or events. What are the significance? What makes sense to them? Why does it struck as an important thing or feature that they want to highlight? Why do they spend time talking about that one event than other things? By highlighting those emphasis that our participants give to their narratives, we can see what are the important things that they care about. And they also allow us to uncover events or details of events that we may not have thought about previously or may not have captured from other participants' stories. So it gives us an opportunity to see some events or to hear the events from the participants' point of view in a story format, and those are very powerful. How can we find those stories or narratives? As we've talked about earlier, through the one-on-one interviews, can be through a critical incident technique. What that means is that the researcher, as the interviewer, can prompt the participants, what may be one thing that is so positively or negatively memorable? What is something that they feel strongly for or against? And by using that prompt, asking our participants to talk about things that they feel strongly for or against, that's a good way to start hearing a narrative from them. Another source that we can find stories or narratives, everyday conversations. What are the things that people talk about? You know, any current event that is ongoing, when you ask participants what is ongoing, how are they understanding the current event, has it evolved, how has it changed or affected their lives, those daily everyday conversations help us see it from a slower snapshot point of view. So it's more like daily or weekly snapshots as the event transpires, as compared to, say, a narrative that we hear, that we ask people to describe, say, their teenage years or their childhood years, which is probably a number of years in the past, but they're singing it from the present. As compared to everyday conversations, it's more of something that's more recent, that is evolving in the recent time frame. So maybe in the last few days, weeks, or even the last few months. Okay. And they can also come in print or online. These days, we can hear a lot of narratives or stories that have been expressed through people's social media sites, their accounts, social media accounts, maybe a tweet that they put out, maybe the pictures that they show on their Instagram account, maybe these things gives us some insight about how they view a certain event. And these views that they have, if we look at it as a snapshot between over a period of time, it does paint a story or narrative to help us understand how the participants think about the events. So stories are very interesting. They're very powerful as well. I love to hear stories, hear what people have to share from their point of view through the things that they write, as well as the pictures or the photos that they take, or things that they draw, things that draw attention to that they draw attention to. Those are very interesting. So now, what are the strengths and limitations of narrative research? Strength number one, richness and depth. It can be very powerful because, as we talked about earlier, those details can come from, say, people's tweets, can be from people's pictures on social media, pictures that they take on their cell phones, can be things that they write in their diaries or their personal journals, that if you have access to those sources. So it's very rich because it can come in different kinds of formats, can have a lot of color, can be something audio, can be visual, can even be textile, something that you can feel and touch. So it can be very strong, very powerful, because the richness and depth that can help us listen or help us see the narrative that participants present to us. These data also communicate things that might be difficult or impossible to observe. So perhaps it's difficult for us to observe something that's happening behind closed doors, or if we don't have access to those events when those events happened. But perhaps journalists are able to take pictures at that time, write up what happened, what they saw, and then through those stories and pictures that we see, then we have an insight to it when we did not have it originally. So it's very good that we can have those pictures and audio recordings, or some kind of write-up, whether it's a summary or a detailed write-up about something in the past that we didn't have access to previously, but now with access to those data, we have. What is the limitation or limitations of narrative research? one limitation here is there is a risk that we will have to take in asking participants to recall events. So now, we may, some research we know that it may be very painful when we ask questions to ask participants to recall memories that are maybe painful, or maybe something that's hurtful that they don't want to recall because it brings back a lot of pain, emotional or physical pain. But sometimes some questions we may not know, we may not think that it's going to affect them negatively, but it actually did. So, for example, you may think that asking someone's childhood may be a very a very safe question, but who knows, maybe the person had some traumatic experience during his or her childhood, and then that would trigger some painful memories. So we never know what people had gone through, and we don't know what they might say. So that could be a problem, that can be a limitation. A generalization can also limit or restrict the findings. So if we, depending on the data that we collect, if it's very homogeneous, that might limit our understanding because it's very easy to generalize. But at the same time, it's very limiting because it doesn't show us the full range or spectrum of views or stories on that event. And then, how might participants tell us their stories? Is it entirely factual, truthful, or maybe there might be some elements of fiction or untruth in it mixed into it, or some ambiguity that make it look like something else than what really happened. So those can be problematic when we look at narrative research, when we deal with stories. Now, finally, we look at ethnography. Ethnography is the fourth kind of way of that we can analyze, collect data. It's interesting because we are entering into the environment that our participants are in. I always talk about my friend who did research in Vietnam. She spent almost a complete year in a certain jungle studying some monkeys there. Now, as I understand, the monkeys actually only live in that jungle, or maybe only in Vietnam. So, in order for my friend to study these monkeys, she had to be in that jungle. So, she spent almost a year there. The only way to study those monkeys will be going to the environment where the monkeys live, so that she can see firsthand how do the monkeys actually live and communicate among them, each other, as in the monkeys. So in that sense, she was performing some form of ethnographic research. It gives us an opportunity to see holistically why do people, in my friend's sense, monkeys, interact in certain fashion. That is, in a natural environment for them, as well as the natural way that they communicate. Think, for instance, if I would ask, how do you communicate with your best friend? Imagine you and your best friend talking. Maybe your best friend is not in the same city as you. Maybe you call your best friend, or maybe you Skype with your best friend. We talk about things. So those are the natural setting or natural environment that you and your best friend are talking in. But if I were to say, please bring your best friend to my office and I would like to observe you and your best friend to talk, well, you guys would probably not feel very comfortable because it's not the natural environment that you spend time together and talking, and it's awkward because you know someone is looking at you and listening into your conversation. So in that way, it is not natural, you feel awkward, the conversation is not free flowing. That is not helpful. So if I want to know how certain individuals react or behave in their environment, I have to enter into their environment, to be there embedded in that environment so that I can observe them in their natural setting. The ethnographer focuses on how people interact with one another, how do they speak with one another. The structure can be different, can be very distinct. Think about this. Think about your best friend again. Say you and your best friend are talking. Let's say at a coffee shop, okay, or at a coffee shop. No one's watching the two of you talking. You might have your own lingo. You might have some secret codes, or maybe there's a certain look that you can demonstrate to your friend, and your friend understands completely what you meant when you give that look. Now, it can be quite different. Say you are with with other friends, with a larger group of friends, or say you're with your parents or maybe the elders in your family. So those lingos, you probably may not want to use them. So the environment is different, resulting in the structure and the speech being different as well. So for us to really understand people acting in their natural environment, we have to be embedded long time to watch how they talk, how they react to one another, as though no one is watching them. Autoethnography is an interesting way of doing ethnography. Essentially, what that means is that the researcher is chronicling his or her experience while performing the ethnography. So the ethnographer is not studying the environment as a embedded researcher, but instead the researcher, the autoethnographer, is doing that research, studying him or her own experience in that environment. So it can be very personal because it is how you feel, how you view things. And it can be very emotional because depending on what the context or situation the autoethnographer is researching. The autoethnographer also shares the environment, as we mentioned, because he or she is researching his or her own view in the context that he or she finds himself or herself. We're capturing all the interactions as we can in the natural environment and the natural context. It is a first-hand experience because the ethnographer is experiencing going through the same things as everyone else in that environment. So think back about my friend who was doing the ethnographic study on monkeys in Vietnam. She was there. I don't know if she ever spent any time in the hotel at night, or she spent all day, all night in that jungle. I'm not sure. I never asked her that. But she spent substantial amount of time in the jungles, and you can imagine she might have to climb trees. There are probably lots of mosquitoes trying to bite her, and there might be snakes and probably other animals in the jungle. So she has to contend with the same elements that those monkeys have to. And you can imagine that she's going through the same or similar experience as the research subjects that she's trying to study. Autoethnography, just like any other qualitative research, we tend to not have a very concrete or well-developed research question because we try to be as flexible as we can. At the same time, we don't want to be overly broad because if you're too broad, then we may not know if we're studying what we want to study, or we do not know if we have collected the data that we're trying to collect. So we have some idea, fairly good idea what we want to study, what we're focusing on, but at the same time, it's not cast in stone. It's not something that we say, oh, for sure this is going to be at the beginning and for sure it's going to be the same thing at the end. The research question has some flexibility, especially for qualitative research. Researchers sometimes can tend to massage the data to make it fit what they want. That will be quite unethical. Researchers should always work with the data, and then whether it speaks to or not to what they want to express, they should also always express them and report them honestly and authentically. Ethnography can focus on one or small number of cases. Sometimes one specific interesting instance or very unique instance can be okay, and we don't need to have a large number of participants or cases that we study. Analysis typically will always be rather deep, because we spend a lot of time embedded in the environment, so a lot of deep details and analysis and deep into the details that we observe, that we hear, that we see. And what is another benefit or advantage of doing ethnography? We get to see the mundane parts of the daily lives. So imagine my friend who is in the jungle. She might be there a good number of hours every day. There might be a time where the monkeys are playing or fighting among each other. They might be doing different things, but probably there are times when they actually are sleeping, or maybe they're not doing much. They might be just sitting there. So those the mundane, uninteresting, very slow time during the day. She was there watching those monkeys, seeing what they are doing. So ethnographers spend a lot of time in the environment. They see all the action that is going firsthand, but at the same time, not everyone's lives is exciting 24/7. There are times that it's kind of slow, not much is happening, but it's okay. Those periods of time, those are times that we also want to capture. We want to understand why are there those slow times, why what happens during that time. Is it preparation for something else, or is it just really time to unwind, to relax, and to be still? And so now finally, what are the strengths and limitations of ethnography? Firstly, is it allows us to collect rich, deep descriptions or data of the environment. Remember that we have spent months or years studying a community or a population, a group of people. So because we are so embedded in that environment for that long period of time, we have a lot of information about that setting, the things, the environment, as well as the people, the interactions, and their behavior. Because of that, we become so intimately familiar with the environment, the events, and things that happen. Imagine ourselves spending, say, 6 months, 9 months in a village in Africa. Suppose you've never been to that village. That's entirely new environment for us, and everything is new. We absorb, we take it in, and we get to see so many things that we may not have known if we had not lived in that environment. So what are the downside or the limitation of ethnography? It takes a lot of time. Not every researcher wants to spend or is able to spend that kind of time and resources to study a community that in that kind of depth. So not everyone is willing to do that, and so the time commitment can be huge. And because we spend so much time in that environment, in that setting, we get to learn a lot, we get to see a lot, we get to collect a lot of data that can slow down the researchers' analysis of that project. And so therefore we talk about limitation number two. Researcher gets overly saturated with the things that he or she sees and observes and hears. And because we spend so much time embedded in the environment, in that setting, it was so immersed in that data, we may over-identify with the participants. So when that happens, it's quite difficult to take a step back and then to analyze the entire experience, the entire period that we have spent in that environment. So that's another limitation. So overall, what we have looked at in this chapter, we've seen different methods, the common methods that we use, qualitative methods to collect data. We look for narratives, the stories that might emerge from a participant's point of view and perspectives. And these are all very interesting and very powerful methods to hear the nuances, the different subjective and constructed social narratives that people have. And that concludes chapter 16.